Thank you so much for joining us on this webinar to explore the Rhode Island Food Policy Council's COVID-19 Food Policy Database. My name is Rachel Santo, and I'm a Senior Program Coordinator with the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future and the Food Policy Networks Project. Also on the call with us is Ann Palmer, Program Director at the Center, and we're delighted to welcome Nessa Richman and Nina Wolff Landau today to share their motivation behind creating a database of over 120 local and state food systems policies related to COVID, and how food policy practitioners across the country can use it to inform their work. So we thank you all for joining us, and thank you for your work and all the work you're doing to support your communities. Before we begin, we're going to briefly discuss the logistics of the webinar. As you can tell, we're in meeting mode and not webinar mode, and our goal with this is to make the session more interactive, and so we encourage you to ask questions and chat to one another in the chat box and to share your experiences throughout the webinar. And also, if you have any questions along the way, please include those in the chat box. Nina and Nessa will first begin with a brief presentation of their database, sharing why and how they created it, the nuts and bolts of using it, and some notable policies they found while compiling the database. We will then open it up for Q&A. All attendees will be muted, but if you have a question or comment, again, during the webinar, you can ask it in the chat box. And if you would like, during the Q&A session, if you're on the phone portion, you can also hit *9 if you want to raise your hand to ask the question, and then *6 to unmute yourself when we call on you. We will be recording this webinar, and we will share it with everyone that's registered in the next few days. And sorry, advance the slide. If you are not familiar with us, this webinar is being hosted by the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future, an interdisciplinary center located at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Our work focuses on the intersection of diet, the environment, food production, and public health. And the Food Policy Networks Project is one of our center's projects, with the goal of building the capacity of food system stakeholders to reform local, state, regional, and tribal food systems through effective public policy. We do that through training, sharing best practices, networking with other food policy councils and leaders, and developing and providing food policy resource materials. If you're not familiar with the Food Policy Networks Project, I encourage you to check out our website, which is foodpolicynetworks.org, and to join our listserv if you're not already part of it. Before we begin, we'd also like to introduce our speakers. Nessa Richman is the Rhode Island Food Policy Council's Network Director. She leads the council in achieving its mission to promote an equitable, economically vibrant, and environmentally sustainable food system in Rhode Island. She works with the council's 25 volunteer members, state agencies, nonprofit leaders, and other core partners to build coalitions that align resources, promote good food and agriculture policy, and execute high-impact projects and programs that fill critical gaps. Her work is aimed at ensuring the responsiveness and resiliency of the local Rhode Island food system to increase and expand equitable food access and food sector vitality, especially in the time of COVID-19. And Nina Wolff Landau graduated from Brown University last May 2020 with a degree in environmental justice. While at Brown, Nina worked at the Climate and Development Lab, doing transportation policy research and analyzing climate impacts of industrial agriculture at Columbia University's Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. She was also an active leader in the Rhode Island's Sunrise movement. Over the summer, Nina worked as a public policy research institute at the Rhode Island Food Policy Council and developed this database that we're going to be exploring today. So now I'm going to hand it off to Nessa to begin the discussion, and we encourage you to stay active and participate even if your video is off. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I know, Nina, you're going to start off our slides, but while you're doing that, I'll just thank you for the kind introduction and for inviting us to share this work with your audience. First, I want to just give a really brief introduction to our network. The Rhode Island Food Policy Council has been around since 2011. We're a non-governmental organization. We were launched on Food Day at the State House here in Rhode Island. And our mission, as Rachel said, is to promote an equitable, economically vibrant, and environmentally sustainable food system for the state of Rhode Island. These are our 2020 council members, I think you can see now. They are volunteers who are expert in many different parts of the food system. They all serve terms of usually 3 years, sometimes 2 or 4. This year we have farmers, fishermen, aquaculturists, food trade associations, universities and hospital representatives, public health and food access advocates, food justice workers, community activists, and really our goal is to create a strong network in order to help our members find common ground and shared priorities. Just a little bit of background about our organizational structure. We currently have 2 full-time and 2 part-time staff, plus the occasional intern, and we have 23 council members. And our funding is about 50% from private foundations and the other 50% from federal grants and state contracts. So like most of you, I would assume our role has changed since the COVID-19 pandemic started. We've convened emergency virtual gatherings of various stakeholder groups like community gardeners and commercial kitchen users. We've aggregated and shared information through a dedicated COVID-19 response webpage and social media updates on a daily basis. We supported a successful joint application to the CFAP Farmer to Family Food Box program that came from our state's primary food hub and food bank in cooperation with each other. And we've also started a couple of pilot projects that are bringing local seafood to food insecure populations. Our state has also taken a lot of emergency actions, like most states have, in terms of temporary non-residential eviction and utility shutoff moratoriums, small business grant programs, waivers to SNAP, and the development of the PEBT program, and much, much more. You can advance the slide one, Nina. So these are, emergency responses that I've just gone over that we've taken and that our state has taken. And on top of them, now, as the pandemic continues, we are working with state agencies and elected officials and communities on the more medium and long-term planning processes to ensure a more resilient food system going forward. So many of these are related to educating and advocating about public policy and regulatory change. So when the shift from an emergency response to longer-term rebuilding and resilience work started, we felt a need to understand what the options were for creating sustainable policy and regulatory change. We didn't have any dedicated funding to do this, but luckily we had some money for a summer intern, and we hired Nina to help out, and you'll hear from her in just a moment, to research the national landscape of COVID-19 related food policies so that we could identify from our position here in Rhode Island the policies that would help us in our state. So we did it because we knew that no one else in our state was going to do it. We saw it as a service for our governor and for our state legislature who don't have food systems expertise or the bandwidth to do a deep dive into this in the midst of pandemic response. And the last point I want to make before I hand it over to Nina is just about how I think you can use this tool. So we see this as being something for us, for the food policy councils and the food policy networks. We know, at least here in Rhode Island, we can't expect to hand this tool to our elected officials and have them pick it up and run with it. It needs to be digested. And so we hope that you'll be able to get someone to dig in and do that digestion for your state, maybe convene a conversation with stakeholders about how the ideas within it might align with your organization's mission, your state's political environment, and your level of resources. So obviously this is going to be different for each state. Maybe you have a champion in the legislature that you can work with. Maybe you have a group of core partners with whom you can form a coalition. Or maybe you have a direct line of communication with a policy advisor to the governor or the person who's in charge of your state's food access plan. So those are just some initial ideas, and Nina and I will both be happy to answer questions after we do the deep dive into the tool itself. So Nina, take it away.
Thank you, Nessa, and nice to see everyone. Really excited to be here. So first, just want to talk about a little bit more about the goal of our research, which was really to understand the themes and outstanding examples of food policy response to COVID-19 across the country at state, municipal, and county levels to inform our council's policy priorities and advocacy. And we saw that across the country in response to COVID-19, the US government responded at all levels with a range of immediate emergency responses. And there were many actions taken by Rhode Island and other states and municipalities that have been extremely important and widely used responses, like emergency declarations, policies regarding outdoor dining, parking changes for curbside pickup, school meal waivers, increased funding to food banks, waivers and pilot programs for SNAP, WIC, and other federal food assistance programs, and many others like those. This database does not include those very common responses. Rather, we sought to create a summary list of key food policy responses that went beyond the standard. We ended up organizing them into 3 main impact areas: food access, support for farm, fish, and food businesses, and worker protection and compensation. So to build this database, the process really involved using a lot of resources that I'm sure all of you are very familiar with. I spent a lot of time reading through a lot of great listservs and newsletters, from the Healthy Food System Weekly Update to many resources from the Center for Livable Future. I attended a lot of webinars like this one to hear from many practitioners and policy experts, a few of whom I see on this webinar, which is exciting. And I also went to trackers from states and cities themselves, from their legislatures and governors, in addition to using some food-specific trackers, both from the Milken Institute as well as the Healthy Food Policy Project. So there's a lot of really great resources out there that I drew on. We also did some searches for specific states, high-performing states like California, Michigan, New York, Oregon, and Washington, and neighbor states, because in Rhode Island, it's really relevant for what other New England states are doing. And finally, there was a few topics we were particularly interested in around protein processing and seafood, as well as worker protection. So I was specifically looking at those as well. So this is just a quick screenshot of the database. We'll dive into it further, and it looks a little bit overwhelming at first glance, but I just want to give everyone this quick preview because I'm going to talk about the coding system, which I think number one makes it a much more usable database, and number two is really how we were thinking about how these policies impact our food system. So we have 9 codes for our database. I'll just walk through each code, and then I'll actually take you into the database itself, explain how it's set up, and go through some examples of how we can use it effectively. So our first category is worker protection and compensation. So this covers permanent and temporary changes that require PPE and other COVID-specific protections, paid sick leave, unemployment insurance, workers' compensation changes, and anti-retaliation clauses. Our second code is food access, which is really broad, so that has a number of policies marked with that code. These cover things like support for urban gardens, allowing restaurants to serve as food retail, buying food from local producers for food banks, grants for storage and transportation of food, and innovative meal programs. Policies that support food access for vulnerable populations through the charitable food system and for government food programs also fall into this category. And I don't think I said this yet, but these codes are not mutually exclusive. So many policies are marked with multiple codes, as we'll see. Our third code is racial equity. So that includes many of the worker protections, both because these protections are largely for frontline jobs, which are disproportionately held by Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, and because BIPOC experience retaliation at much greater levels than white people. Other policies in this category include those that prioritize BIPOC-owned and operated producers and food businesses, and BIPOC-focused food access initiatives. Our fourth code is supporting charitable and emergency food response. So that includes reimbursing producers for costs related to donating food, programs that buy food and pay local restaurants to produce free or low-cost meals, and grants for infrastructure for the charitable food system, which we saw in a number of states. Then we kind of thought through the difference between ecosystem support and market support for a variety of actors in the food system. So ecosystem support includes infrastructure, logistical support, capital needs, finance, and regulatory flexibility. And Code 5 covers ecosystem support for processing and manufacturing, whereas Code 6 covers ecosystem support for local farmers, harvesters, and fishers. Code 7 is market support for our local farmers, harvesters, and fishers. So that includes establishing programs or one-time expenditures to purchase those products, setting up pipelines, and facilitating license and permit access to expand our markets. Code 8 combines the ecosystem and market support for food, retail, and hospitality. So there were less of those policies overall, but those include grants for restaurants, allowing restaurants to convert to retail, programs that pay restaurants to produce meals, and caps on food delivery service fees. And then the last code, Code 9, is workforce initiatives. Workforce initiatives are those that create or retain jobs, including keeping restaurant workers employed or bringing them back through those meal programs I've mentioned, conservation core programs, and business grant programs as well. So now I'm going to switch my screen to show everyone the database itself and walk through it. So you should now be seeing our Excel spreadsheet. I'm going to walk through the columns and the coding system. So again, if it looks overwhelming, have no fear. We're going to walk through it. So first, I want to point out we have 3 tabs on the spreadsheet. The first is how to use the database. So this is what is the database, what the codes are, so what I just walked through, what's not included, and then directions on how to use custom views, which I'll go through in a moment. Our second tab is the main database itself. And then our third tab is policies that have low or no budgetary implications. So you'll see our column A is our policy name. Our column B is our level of government at which the policy was passed. That's state, municipal, or county for this spreadsheet. Location, brief description of function is column D. And then columns E through M are the codes, so I'll talk through those in a moment, but those are the categories we just discussed. Column N is a policy actor, so executive, legislative, or administrative, and in some cases it was multiple. And then the policy tool, and then the final columns are a link to more information, additional links, and any notes that might be relevant there. So for those of you who haven't used custom views before, that's how we filter this spreadsheet to bring up the policies we're interested in that pertain to a specific code. So at the top of your spreadsheet, you'll see this view tab, and you'll be able to click on custom views. It might look a little different depending what version of Excel you have, but you go through view to custom views, and then you'll see here you select one of these 9 different codes, which will filter the spreadsheet for you. So for example, if we're interested in policies that advance racial equity in our food systems, we'll click show, and you'll see now that many less policies are showing, many fewer policies, and you'll see that all the policies that are showing have a yes in this third code, which is racial equity. So this now has condensed what you're seeing to just policies that relate to racial equity. If you're ready to switch to a different view, to a different code, you'll go right back here to custom views, and you can choose a different code, or if you want to get back to your full database, you'll click the option that says full database. So that lets you get back to the full database of policies. So I'm just going to go through a few examples. And again, if anyone has questions about kind of how to navigate through the database, we're happy to answer those as well. So we're going to start with a really great program in Vermont that was an example of an innovative meal program. So we're going to go into our custom views. We'll go into food access. It's a food access program. I'm going to scroll down a little bit here. And if you don't see it, which might be the case, you can always do our control find. So we're going to look for Everyone Eats. So here we have Everyone Eats. It's a state level program. It's in Vermont. This is a really great program. You'll see a lot of colors are highlighted here. So this applies to food access. It's coded for supporting our charitable and emergency food response, for market support for local farmers, harvesters, and fishers, ecosystem and market support for food, retail, and hospitality, and workforce initiatives. So this is also a really great example of how to move a pilot project to a policy that was funded by the state. It started with a pilot from late March to late May that produced and delivered 25,000 frozen, ready-to-heat meals to Vermonters in need, bringing back 21 Vermont workers, and funded by the food bank and philanthropy in Vermont. It also put in $10,000 into Vermont-grown food. After some successful tracking and evaluation and a pitch to the House Commerce Committee, the state funded this program at $5 million using CARES Act funding. So this pilot is now expanded to 10 operators producing 260,000 meals a month through December of 2020. And they were able to demonstrate that this would put back $1.56 million in monthly revenue into the food service economy and $3.12 million a week into the state's economy and associated jobs and other economic multipliers. They also were able to demonstrate a really significant impact on local food production and purchasing. So another example policy that I'm going to bring up here is a worker protection policy. So we'll go back into our custom views. We're going to code 1, worker protection and compensation, and we'll click on show. So I'm going to scroll down to bring up a policy in Minnesota, which is an emergency executive order. This executive order clarifies that employers are prohibited from retaliating against employees who voice safety concerns to management related to COVID-19. And there was a really great report that came out this summer from the National Employment Law Project, which reported that Black workers are twice as likely, more than twice as likely, to face retaliation as white workers for reporting safety concerns about working conditions that could spread COVID-19. So this is a really great example of a low-cost policy and a really high-impact, important policy to protect workers. And the third one I'll just highlight briefly is actually a municipal level policy, and it is a food access policy. So we'll go again to code 2, food access. And I'm gonna search Pittsburgh because that's where our policy takes place. So it's a long resolution name, but it tells you the key information. So Pittsburgh Resolution 2020-0298, authorizing and directing the directors of the Departments of Finance and City Planning to establish incentives that encourage and empower residents to create and maintain urban gardens and urban agriculture sites. So this is a really great resolution at the city level. The council specified that this may include waiving fees, but it also can just include eliminating certain program requirements and really decreasing the barriers for resident participation in city-sponsored programs that facilitates access to urban gardens and urban farming. So this is a food access policy, but it's also really a food justice and food sovereignty policy, facilitating people's ability to grow food and transform lots that are abandoned through existing city programs, for example. So I'm going to switch back to the slides and go through a little bit of our key findings. I know that was a lot of information. So we did a little digestion for the Food Policy Council here in Rhode Island. And again, we have key findings across food access, support for food businesses, and worker protection and compensation. So in food access, we had kind of 5 key findings that we saw across the country. Number 1 is, like this Vermont program, we saw a lot of actual county and municipal level versions of the Vermont program that supported local restaurants and their workers in producing prepared and storable meals at low or no cost to residents. Some of these programs really required a local food purchasing component, and others didn't, and they were really focused on meeting the need of local residents. The second is that we saw 5 states, including Arizona, Colorado, New York, Pennsylvania, and Vermont, working to incentivize food donations and purchase food from local farms to distribute through the emergency feeding system. We also saw 3 different states, Arizona, Massachusetts, and Texas, allow and assist restaurants in converting to small community-based food retailers. And we also saw an investment in food access infrastructure. That food access infrastructure included processing, storage, and distribution. Finally, North Dakota invested in systems and equipment for more retailers to participate in the SNAP program, online and offline, whereas a number of other states like Arizona, Massachusetts, and South Carolina expanded their SNAP produce incentives programs to raise the daily dollar limit that a customer can spend, as well as expanding the vendors that can take those SNAP produce incentives. So Massachusetts is a really great example there. In our support for farm, food, and fish businesses, we saw that 12 states and Washington, D.C. secured moratoriums on commercial utility shutoffs, and 28 states and D.C. secured moratoriums on evictions for commercial tenants. We also have seen a number of states and municipalities work to restrict third-party food delivery service fees to support local restaurants, which are really struggling and continuing to struggle. And 9 states have created grant programs to fund small and medium-sized meat processing facilities to support their local food infrastructure and to reduce some of the backlog that is really impacting meat producers. In Rhode Island and a few other states, there's been some great support for local meat and fish suppliers through increased licensing and sales opportunities. So here in Rhode Island, there's a temporary direct-to-consumer allowance for finfish, and other states like Wyoming have been really creative in allowing a workaround for meat processing inspection by creating a food ownership share legislation, which you can find in the policy database as well. And finally, a number of states, 35 states and DC, have created grant programs that support small businesses, some with separate programs for local farm and food businesses, and some with an allocation for those businesses. And finally, the worker protection and compensation takeaways. 4 states and a number of cities have enacted whistleblower and anti-retaliation protections. We've seen 9 states enact worker compensation policies for frontline workers that include COVID-19 illness. Virginia has really led the country in enacting enforceable workplace safety standards through a temporary enforceable standard. And that's really because federally OSHA has not created any enforceable workplace safety standard. And lastly, 3 states, in addition to the grant programs I mentioned, have funded dedicated grant programs to support safety measures for farms, food processors, and other food businesses. So here in Rhode Island, like in I'm sure a number of other states, the cost of a policy is really a key concern and a key limitation and non-starter if we are bringing recommendations for very expensive policies going forward. So it was really important here to highlight policies with low or no budgetary implications. So we pulled those policies out, and they're, like I mentioned and showed, they're on the 3rd tab of the database. And those include a lot of worker protection policies, as well as a lot of other creative ways to facilitate better food system access and resilience over the long term. I'm going to pass it back over to Nessa for some questions.
Yeah, we're happy to take any questions that you have about the development of the database and about how we have been using it so far to address what in our state is, I'm sure, similar to your state's, a very severe food insecurity crisis, coupled with farm, fisheries, and food businesses that are suffering due to the economic downturn. So I don't know, Rachel, if you've been tracking questions, but we're happy to take any that folks may have at this time.
I have been. It seems like the one question that was asked in the chat box has been answered. We will be sending out the recording and slides to anyone who registered for the webinar. I did receive one question in email form. Let me pull it open. And it is a broader question, but how can food councils impart substantial policy changes in areas other than local or state government if, for example, the legislature is strongly against changes to the food system at the government level? So I don't know, it's not directly related to your database, but if you would like to answer it, you can, and we'll keep an eye out for other questions in the chat box.
I'm sure there are a lot of folks who have better answers than I do to that question. I'm happy to start off and then invite anyone else who wants to participate. But I think if you're working with the state legislature that that isn't supportive, that probably the best place to start is with coalition building outside of government, to build a strong coalition that crosses, if possible, political lines and gets folks on the same page about a priority for a particular policy that aligns with your mission and aligns with their mission as well, and then try to identify maybe maybe a legislator or someone who is newly elected who may have an open plate right now and be interested in finding something that they would be able to champion. Obviously, we all know that policy change generally takes time, and so the situation, the landscape that you have right now might be really different than the landscape, in January or a couple of years down the line, depending on the election cycle for your state.
All right, it looks like we have some questions coming in too. Can you talk about through your research methodology briefly? Where did you search for the policy? So I think you did cover this, and I'm not sure if you just want to go into more detail or if we can just refer to if that person missed the beginning of the webinar. But if there are any other details that you left out, Nina, do you want to share this?
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of the policies were kind of hidden in newsletters, and Nessa and I talked about this as kind of finding hidden pearls, and I think that really was a good way to describe the process. So I think I really, as soon as I started the internship, subscribed to every food newsletter that Nessa recommended and signed up for a lot of webinars, and a lot of my time in June was spent on a lot of really great webinars. And like I said, there are some people on this call who facilitated those webinars or spoke on those webinars. I think other really great places that I mentioned maybe briefly were the trackers that the National Conference of State Legislatures has, the National Governors Association, the National League of Cities Action Tracker, the Healthy Food Policy Projects has a local food access policy index. There was a compiled policy resources spreadsheet for food policy councils as well that I used. The Milken Institute Center for Public Health had a COVID-19 food response and policy tracker as well. So those are some examples, but it was often kind of through the grapevine, and I'd find one thing on a tracker that led me to another great resource. So that was often how I found policies.
Great, thanks, Nina. And also, I just saw the clarifying question that they didn't know if you had went to Municode or other legislative databases. Sounded like you went to some state ones, but.
Yes, and I basically went into legislative databases as policies came up and I wanted to find out more, find out where the status of policies were.
Great. There are a few questions about if you have a plan going forward for maintaining the information or adding to it as time goes on.
Yep, that's a great question. It's not something we've really approached yet, but we would love to talk further about that with the Center for a Livable Future and anyone else who wants to participate in that conversation. It will need to keep, to stay updated. I think this is the beginning of a conversation about, rebuilding and resilience policy that's going to go on for several years. And it would be wonderful to be able to use this, in my opinion, to use this as a platform for, something continually updated.
Great, thanks, Nessa. There's a question about how you specifically are using the database in the Rhode Island Food Policy Council. How do you choose which policies to prioritize your advocacy around? And also, separately, will you be tracking evaluation or impacts in the database eventually? So that's kind of related to your other question.
Yeah. Can I ask to come off of the screen share view, Nina, if you don't mind? I think it's better this way when we're doing Q&A. So I think that question was about how we are using the database so far, and I would say that we're still at the beginning of that process. So what we have done so far is to present it first to our policy committee. So the Food Policy Council has a policy committee, and presented it to them in a kind of a more digested form with a memorandum that laid out some potential avenues for action for the council. And then after it was provided to the committee, we moved to the full council and presented it to them at a full council meeting. And now we're in a process where our council members are able to propose priority policies for the coming legislative session, which in Rhode Island starts on January 1. So I think we have maybe 5 or 6 policy priorities that have been proposed. We'll have a voting process around those policy priorities, and then we will move to developing our platform, our policy priority platform for the coming legislative session. So that's how it's working its way through the council itself. We have also been approached by the state to present kind of a more digested introduction to this database at a meeting of an interagency task force on food and nutrition policy, which will take place in early November. So now that we've presented it internally, we're moving to present it to our state decision makers. That is about where we're at right now. I think that, what we see going forward is once our policy priority areas have been selected, we'll be hosting a roundtable for legislators and other core partners to help start advocating for those priorities. Sometimes we will develop like one-page infographics to share, set up one-on-one meetings with our legislators. It takes kind of a individualized approach, after the selection of the policy priorities, based on what the council members have the bandwidth to do and how they want the staffs to support them through the session.
Thank you, Nessa, and would love to stay up to date to hear what all you're able to get through. We have another question about some of the examples in this database linked to secondary sources with a link for more information in the link for more information column. Were you able to find the legislative or administrative orders, budget appropriations, and other underlying policy documents for those? And if so, can you make those available?
I can speak to that. So some things, it was it was layers and layers to find those underlying documents. So I found them in some cases, not all of the cases, but if they're not on there already, I think that's something that we can discuss further in trying to find some of those documents. But many of them, that's usually when I was going into legislative trackers and databases. And in some cases, things had just passed, so there wasn't further information beyond maybe a press release and then a budgetary proposal, or in other cases, a lot of the grant programs in particular that were passed using CARES Act funding, there was press releases and not a lot of other information.
Thank you, Nina. And a follow-up question to Nessa about the policy priorities. How does the process you just described differ from how you created your priorities in the past?
Well, I mean, like a lot of food policy councils and food policy networks, we keep iterating every year to try and figure out the best way to do this. Our food policy council did not really go through a process of selecting priorities up until 3 years ago, because we were very focused on two particular priorities. One, to create a state level position of Director of Food Strategy in our state, and two, to fund a local agriculture and seafood grant program. So really, when those two things were accomplished, then we were able to move on to more kind of substantive area policy priorities. And I would say that the process that I just described is similar to processes that we used the past couple of years, but that because we now have the database, we're able to be a lot more research-based in that selection process. So there's always going to be, you know, a big element of who is on the council, what are their interests, and how much bandwidth does each of them have to be kind of a champion for a particular policy. But the process itself is something that is similar to the last 2 years, but is now better informed by the opportunity to review all of these different policies within the database. I hope that answers your question okay. I'll also say that the concept of having a roundtable is brand new for this year. That before, when a priority was selected, the champion for that policy on the council would really drive the process forward, and they would just ask the staffs for support in whatever way they wanted that support. But what we've suggested moving forward, because so many people are so busy right now, that we felt a need to create more of a structure for to extend their capacity to engage in policy. And so the roundtable is the way that we are settling on doing that for this year. So the roundtable, again, it'll be virtual. We'll invite a certain set of interested legislators and then a core set of non-governmental partners. And we will introduce our policy priorities and try to create as much of an opportunity as we can for network development within the legislature and between the council and the legislature through virtual means as we can.
Thank you, Nessa. Do we have any other questions? I think we've covered all of them thus far. Well, if not, we want to thank you all for attending today, and thank you especially to Nessa and Nina for creating this database and for sharing it with the broader Food Policy Council community. I think a lot of us are very interested in everything you've compiled, and I think it's going to be a very useful resource for groups around the country that are looking at what they can advocate for and promote for their local and state jurisdictions.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to share it.
Thank you.
All right, well, thanks everyone, and we will send out the recording and a link to the database if you haven't downloaded it already at the end of this call. Thanks.